V1. Plane with no pilot. A new kind of weapon. A new kind of wall. It was time to hide again.
The heart of Manchester. In one of the fiercest raids of the German blitzkrieg on Britain, a storm of bombs wreaks havoc in this proud city. This is on the corner of the old marketplace, with its wealth of historical associations. Yet another link with the past has been destroyed. That was Martin's Bank. Corporation Street, that famous thoroughfare, is a network of hoses as the firemen struggle to gain control of the flames. And here is Piccadilly, Manchester's Piccadilly. It was famous too. But loss and damage do not destroy the spirit or the power of such a place as Manchester. Down at the bottom end of Market Street, St. Mary's Gate lies riven apart by high explosive bombs. The Victoria Arcade is in ruins, its buildings blasted and burned, its great dome shattered. The Coal Exchange, historic centre of trade, shared the city's ordeal. Centuries-old buildings in the shambles suffered only from blast and are now in use again. The famous old marketplace of Manchester, all that remains of it. This was the Royal Exchange, where vast business in cotton was transacted. And this was the volunteer chapel of Manchester Cathedral, a place of worship, desecrated. It is so easy to destroy, so hard to build, but not too hard for the hearts and hands of Manchester. After the war, a new city will rise. Now, the first step is to clear away the ruins, bring down the broken walls of what were once busy stores and peaceful homes. The army lends a hand to civilian workers in clearing away debris. The Empire lends a hand too. This canteen for workers is a gift from the West Indies, from Trinidad and Tobago. Manchester is justly proud of its unshakable men and women. On the roofs of the battered city, the spotters watch the sky, and down below, it's business as usual.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover tomorrow. Just you wait and...
Hello, Mrs. Birtwistle. Thank you for coming in today. We know you wrote a book on the history of Tottington and would like to ask you a few questions about it. We understand that a bomb landed in Tottington on Christmas Eve 1944. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
Well, I wasn't here at the time, but my husband, he was not my husband then, was staying in my home with my parents and with me. And the announcement was that a flying bomb had landed in a northern village. And my husband's sisters said, that'll be Tottington. I thought, it can't be Tottington, because I'd never been here, but I realised it was a very, very small place, and it seemed such a strange chance. But when I came here to live, there was evidence of the damage everywhere, because there had been a row of houses opposite the church, and they had gone, and in all the trees around the church there were bits of curtains and little bits of things that people had valued in their homes, and I thought it was terribly sad. But I'd come from great big raids in Wales, in London, everywhere. Wherever I went, Hitler sent a bomb, and he sent one here ready for me. But I wasn't actually in the village at the time.
How many people were killed by the bomb and how many survived?
Oh, I think it was 5 or 6 who were killed, and of course the rest of the village survived.
Did the bomb affect the people who survived, and where did they go to live?
There again, I didn't live here for a year after that, so I can't tell you that. It wasn't a major problem here. It was in the big cities where there was very little accommodation left whole that it mattered. I think most people moved in with families, with their own families.
Did people feel safe before, and was the atmosphere different after it happened?
Oh, yes. I mean, this was... I gather that when Manchester and Liverpool were bombed, the fires, the light from the fires could be seen here. But it must have been very, very frightening. If it's just one big incident, you never forget it.
Thank you.
Now, please can we ask you some questions about the lines, which was an old railway?
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us more about the route of the old railway?
Yes, it ran from Holcombe Brook. In fact, you can walk on the old railway line, as you probably know. The end started in Bury. It came up, crossed the valley, and came up through Woolfold and through Sunnywood, where I live now. And in Tottington Village, there was a stop, one in Greenmount, and then it went through to Holcombe Brook. And it was very, very pleasant. It went through pretty country, and it was good. It was very, very busily used, and it was, I think, 6p return, 6 old pence, which is 2.5 pence now to Bury.
What kind of people rode on the trains?
Largely people going into work in Bury, and then through to Manchester. School children going into Bury, to the schools in Bury. And lots of people like me, young mothers with babies in prams. And when you heard the train going up, you could run and get down to the station, get your pram on, do your shopping. So it was a mixture of people. People going to work, people going shopping, and people going into school.
What facilities did the train stations have?
Very little indeed. They were very small. Bury was quite busy, but the smaller ones were just a little halt, really. I don't even remember waiting rooms, but in Tottington there was a big siding. You know what a siding is? Well, it's a place where the train can run off to buffers. So this is still a through line. And they used to bring coal and all sorts of goods up here. And when I was coming up here to live, we bought a table down in Plymouth. And it came up by rail. And it was very difficult to get anything in those days. This was a very handsome table, but quite ancient, needed a lot of attention. And my sister-in-law, who used to teach up in Ramsbottom, was in the waiting room and saw this table, which we thought was so very, very beautiful. And she said, "Who has bought that wreck?" And somebody said, "Well, it's got your address on it." And there were not a lot of facilities. It was mostly for passengers, but of course there were heavy goods brought as well, like coal.
So how often did the train run?
It's a long time ago. I would think they were probably half hourly.
In what year did the station actually close?
I really can't remember that. I knew somebody had asked me, but I can't really remember.
Okay, thank you.
Now we shall move on to the Tottington Library. What was the library used for in the war?
It was part of the. The whole building was the council offices, and the library would be unrecognisable to you now. It was just a very, very small collection of books, and it was looked after by the caretaker and his wife. Very, very nice, kindly people. But the rest of it was council offices, and Tottington had its own council then, and they had, in what is now, as you go in through the door, on the right-hand side of the library was the council chamber, which was a beautiful, beautiful room, and had an enormous table which took 12 councillors and the chairman and the cloth. And it must have been left when the house stopped being a private house. They must have left. There were beautiful alcoves where they had statues and things. It was a very nice building, but it was not at all formal. And if you wanted to see council officials, you rang up and said, "Please, can I see the surveyor," or whatever. It was the council, not comparable with Bury Town Hall. It was the council offices.
When did it become a library?
Well, it was already a library when I came here in 1945, but it was updated and improved about, I would think, 30 or 40 years ago, probably.
And why was the location by the library used for the war memorial?
Because it was a piece of land which was owned by the council, and it was central. And it is actually a very beautiful war memorial. Somebody in the village gave all the flowers to go around it, and it has been improved and improved over the years.
Finally, move on to Holly Mount. We understand that Holly Mount was a home to evacuees in World War II. Could you give us an insight to the history of the area?
Yes, a very vague one. Holly Mount belonged to the convent. You're talking about the school part. Yes, it belonged to the convent, and it had always been used a great deal. In the First World War, it was a home for wounded soldiers, and then it belonged to the convent, and it sort of was returned to them, and they ran it as a small school. My father-in-law owned most of the land around that, and he built an extremely ugly hostel, which was very useful and very solid, but it was not useful at all, because there was a big orphanage there, and the children were educated there and lived in a hostel until they went out into various jobs in the area.
So has there always been a convent there?
Yes, it was built as a convent, and of course there is no convent there now, partly because less women become nuns, and there were not enough people to keep it going, so all the nuns were taken to a convent in Belgium, I think. During the last war, there were a lot of refugees there, Belgian refugees, because it was a Belgian order.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us this afternoon. We very much appreciate it.
It was a pleasure.
I was going to say we've got some questions from the audience, if that's all right. William, I think, has a question.
We understand that trams used to run to Tottington. When did they stop running and why?
In the early 1950s. I hadn't seen trams since I was about 4 when I came here, and then I was 25 then. They'd gone from all the streets I knew, except the London streets. And they were great fun, because they were what they called loops. They were single tram lines with a loop for passing places. And the can I go on a bit about the trams?
Of course you can.
When they got to the loops, neither driver wanted to wait. They both wanted to go through, so there'd be passionate arguments, and they'd go. they'd have real rows, and they had some sort of instrument which they ran up and down, so that they could mobilize the tram and annoy the fellow they were supposed to be passing. It was incredible. And there I saw women lip reading. You know about lip reading? Yes? No?
Yeah.
It was the first time I saw women holding entirely silent conversations. I couldn't believe it, because they were sort of mouthing in silence and nodding and agreeing and disagreeing. Fascinating. I'd never seen that. And do you know why they did lip reading? Because they worked with looms in the factories, and the looms were so noisy that they couldn't hear the human voice. So they just mouthed the words. That's all. Okay.
Kirsty has a question now.
What shops were in Tottington during the war?
Well, I'm talking about the end of the war, late 1945. The war was very powerful. There were a lot of cooperative shops. What is now known as the top stores, you know, at the top of the village near the church. That had a draper's shop, and it sold shoes. It sold all sorts of household equipment, buckets and watering cans and garden forks and everything you can think of. Clothespins, needles and cotton, everything. And the groceries were downstairs. There was a butcher, and that had what's called a stable door, a door which is cut in half in the middle, and you close the bottom half, but you couldn't lean over the top and all. It was a butcher shop. There were two shoe repairers, and there was a shoe repairers run by Beaton Holden. You know where there's a little arch halfway up the village street? Well, he had his shoemaker shop above there. There were three butchers, poor butcher, and two butchers, both called Smith, which was a bit difficult in the village. There was a fish and vegetable shop. There was no flower shop then, but where the flower shop is now, excuse me, where the flower shop is now, there was a little baker's shop, and there was very little provision for school meals in those days. School meals were free in cases of need, and Dr. Leaper had to go and inspect the houses and say, yes, Joe Bloggs, he needs school meals, and the little baker's shop made meals. And the children used to clatter up the wooden stairs because a lot of them were still wearing clogs, and have their meals there. There were two dress shops, one of them very good and one of them not quite as interesting. There was a paper shop. There was a post office, which was at the top of the village then. And there were shops which I had never come across called temperance bars, which were really sweet shops which sold lemonade. I thought that was very interesting, temperance bars. There was a plumber. There were two electrician shops. The gas board had a shop where they used to teach you economical recipes, because we were still very, very tightly rationed after the war. The chemist had two shops. He was called Trevor Hughes, and he was a very, very helpful man. And the one lower down the village was purely a chemist, but the other one did a few packets of things, and also had a license. And for great occasions, they used to produce British sherry for favoured customers, of which I'm thankful to say I was one.
Now another question on rationing from Charlotte.
Did all the village shops take ration books?
Sorry, so was it?
Did all the village shops take ration books?
All the food shops, they took ration books, and the rations were tiny, really tiny. Sometimes you would be lucky. I can remember Mr. Hudson, who had a grocer's shop, said to me once, "Would you like spoiled ham?" And I said, "Yes, please." And he said, "Well, I'm catering for a wedding, and there'll be a little bit over." And he popped it in my rations. And I was so grateful, it was unbelievable, because everything's rationed, really. I said it was mainly food, but soap was difficult and things like this. But it didn't really matter to people like me who had never done crew or housekeeping, because you had to learn the hard way how to manage with things. But all the grocer shops, the butchers, not the greengrocer, they all took ration books.
Max has got a question now, please.
Where did the children of Tottington play during war times?
Where did they?
Play.
Well, I wasn't actually in the village, but the town's meadow was there. But people tended to be home in the evenings. I don't know about actually here, but in towns, youngsters weren't out in the evenings at all in case of raids. And I suppose after the flying bomb landed, people were a lot more cautious here. But there was the town's meadow, and there was also that piece of land between Walsher Road and Tottington Road, and that's a very interesting piece of land because that was given to the people of Tottington in those actual words, so that it couldn't be used and still can't be used for building or for anything else. It is purely a green space for children to play. And I suppose people went for walks, as I'm sure you do sometimes, round Tottington Mill and all that area.
Thank you. You mentioned air raids. I think Susanna has a question about air raids.
In the event of an air raid, where did people go?
Well, a lot of people had shelters themselves. Again, I wasn't actually in the village during the war, but the experience of air raids is common to so many places that you know really what's happened. Lots of people, there were two sorts of shelters. There was an Anderson, which was a sort of hoop of corrugated iron, which you dug into the garden so that you were about that much off the ground, and you went down into the shelter. And there was a Morrison, and a Morrison was like an enormous metal table, and that went indoors. And when things were bad, everybody crawled in. I don't know whether there were public shelters here. In a lot of places there were huge concrete shelters, which were specially built. They were about double the size of this platform, and they were concrete, and the whole construction was concrete. But also the base was very, very interesting because it had a concrete base, and the concrete was about this depth, and then above that, you know, when you go on a building site, there are great big thick bags which you had material in, concrete, and they had lime, they had chippings, they had all sorts, and they used to save those. And when the first layer of concrete was the steps, they put these bags on, they stretched them on, and put concrete on top, so that if there was a bad raid and a lot of bombing, the whole structure moved a little. It wasn't solid on the base. There was just enough movement to stop it collapsing, it was a very new sort of construction, very interesting. I think there was one here, but I can't remember.
Roxana has a question.
Where did children go to school during the war?
Here, in Tottington, there were 3 schools. There was the National School up at the church, which has just been made into a lovely church hall, and there was the Methodist School, which is now a lovely tall building up Wesley Street, which I'm sure you've seen. St. John's had a little tiny school, which is now made into little houses. Roman Catholic school was, of course, Hollywell. And Laurel Street was just being built when war broke out, and they left part of that. They used what was finished. They left the rest. And my sister-in-law, who taught in the church school, used to go down to the centre. It was called the centre then, because they had a few laboratories. And she used to go down there to teach science, taught theoretical science up at the church school, and then traipsed the whole class down to Laurel Street, to the centre, which was tiny, really tiny then. I mean, buildings like this are enormous as compared with what British schools were like. Absolutely enormous. And I lived in a big town, and I would think that the core area, the teaching area, is much bigger than the school I went to. Is that the sort of thing you wanted to hear?
I wonder if I might just come in with a quick question. You mentioned that the schools were much smaller. I'm sure that the children would be astonished to learn that there was another school in Tottington, and in fact it was in the house where we used to live on Sunnybower Street.
Miss Beers?
Yes, which a friend of ours used to go to, of course.
Yes. They were called Dame schools, weren't they? Originally, it was just where a woman of reasonable education would take children in and teach them the basics.
Yes.
That's about it, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. There were 24 pupils. It was in the house where we used to live. Those of you who
24?
Yes, those of
Gosh,
you...
you must have been packed.
Yeah, those who know where we used to live on Sunnybower Street, the first house on the left.
And the lady next door made lunches.
That's right, yes, and the lounge was a classroom with 12 pupils, and the dining room was a classroom with 12 pupils, and the smallest of the bedrooms was used as the music room, and the two sisters who ran the school, their rooms were the other two main bedrooms. And in the cloakroom underneath the stairs, there were still 12 coat pegs on the wall from when it was a school. So it was 2 coats per peg in those days. And someone who lives across the road from Mrs. Burtwhistle, who's a friend of hers, and that same lady used to teach with my mother at a school in Bury. She actually went there as a pupil up to age 11 when she went to Bury Grammar School.
I almost forgot. There was also Claremont, wasn't there?
Yes.
Claremont was a private school
Yes.
up at Hollymount.
Yes.
And it was not specifically a Catholic school. I think all sorts of people went there. It's surprising how much provision there was. And I mean, this is not, it's just vaguely connected with what you asked. There was in the grounds of the town hall an old stone, about so tall and so wide, and it had, it was inscribed with the history of the donations to educate the poor children of Tottington, just as Eton was founded for the poorest children as well. So, you know, the same principle. And I think the first person who donated money was in 1712 and left about £2 to pay a schoolmaster. I hope, ladies and gentlemen of the staff, you do a bit better than that these days. But it was a very, very interesting bit about the history of Tottington, that stone survived somewhere. And the first school was where the police station was built, which is now a nursery school. And technically, I think that stone may well belong to the police, but we won't tell them that. And it has been saved. It was being absolutely wrecked, and I was one of the people who got really upset over losing that little valuable piece of history. And it has been saved, and the vicar's kindly looking after it in his cellar. And when everything, all the new building around the school is finished, it will go into the wall as a record of the generosity of the people who had a little more money in Tottington and cared about education. And education is the most valuable thing of all. And it doesn't start the day you go to school, it starts the day you're born. You're learning all the time. And I hope the things I'm telling you are accurate.
I'm sure they are. We've got another question from Katie about evacuees.
Did any families in Tottington have evacuees staying with them?
How many?
Did any families in Tottington have evacuees staying with them?
I'm sorry, I am deaf. Say it again.
Did any
Can I have a teacher to say it for me?
Yeah. Did any families in Tottington have evacuees staying with them?
I don't know. Probably. But I can't tell you that. I know they were up in Rawtenstall, but I think perhaps this was rather near Manchester. You would probably have grandparents who could tell you that, but that I don't know.
Okay, Jason has a question now.
Before the health centre was built, where did people go when they were ill?
There was Ramsbottom Cottage Hospital, and there was Bury Infirmary, which has now been demolished. Fairfield was a workhouse, which meant where the poor people who couldn't live in their own homes went. But in Tottington, there were two nursing homes. There was one at the bottom of Hilda Avenue, which was a maternity home, where an awful lot of people of my age were born. They talk about it, you know, and so many of them were born. It must have been a very busy place. And then there's another one, which is now, there was another place, which is at the junction again of Walshaw Road and Bury Road, which was a small private nursing home. And we also had a most gallant and kind lady called Nurse Smith, who was the district nurse. I'm sure you will remember, Mr. Finn, Nurse Smith, who was a tiny lady on a gigantic bike. And she was very, very useful, greatly used in the village. But I think it's the two homes, Cottage Hospital and Bury Infirmary. I think that was all the division.
Were there village doctors and dentists? The children wondered about it when people just have minor illnesses. Did they just go to?
You would go, well, yes. I came at the same time as Dr. Leeper. Your parents and grandparents will probably remember. He came out of the army. He came here about the time I came. And he lived in the, what is now called, is it called Homewood, at the bottom of Sunny Bar. He had a younger partner, and they attended to everything in the village. He stitched you up, and he did all sorts of things. It wasn't nearly, the health centre in Tottington now is enormous and deals with everything. For a dentist, you had to go into Bury. But Dr. Leeper did absolutely everything else with his younger partner. And he was a very comforting sort of man. I remember he always expected one of my daughters on Christmas Day, because they would cut themselves, they'd interfere with their father was carving the turkey. One of them wouldn't eat a turkey because it looked like a bird, so she used to have sardines for lunch after Christmas. And she'd always cut her thumb or something on the sardine tin, and it was down to Dr. Leeper's to be stitched and fussed over and given a sweet and sent home, told to be careful next time. But we were very, very fortunate in our doctors, although a lot of people also went down to Woolfold. There was a doctor down there as well.
Lucy has a question about pastimes in the war.
What pastimes were there for children and adults?
Exactly the same things as you do now. Board games, well, I'm wrong when I say exactly, because we didn't have Scrabble, we didn't have that. Drafts, Ludo, all sorts of games. Children used to play out more. I can remember seeing children with this enormous skipping rope, one end tied to the lamppost and somebody at the other end turning. You'd see children with hoops, scooters, the lucky ones with tricycles left over from before the war. Very much the same sort of games I think that people play now. And most small areas had a driver's team, a hockey team, and what have you.
And finally from the floor, I think Rhiannon has got a question.
What factories were there in Tottington during the war?
Oh, umpty. When I came up here, I was horrified by the darkness and the dirt and the soot about. There was the foundry, which was making shell cases for the army. There were cotton mills. There was the mill down in Tottington Mill in the valley was an enormous mill, and until it went out of production, it had 1,000 looms, so it really was enormous. But a lot of the small offshoots of the mill were still in production, and there was what they called an engraving shop up quite near the farm, and there they made copper rollers for printing, because Tottington had very, very good water, so they could dye and bleach, and if you dyed, you needed printing machines to make your patterns on the material. And there was Bolholt, which was an enormous mill. It made literally millions of yards of cotton, printed cotton, for the West African trade. Brilliant colours, and actually extremely good quality, because when the Japanese started up, they used the same designs, but they used cheaper dyes. But the ones done here were extremely good. And there were also, there was Riggs's mill in Hawkshaw, and Mr. Riggs, I'd never been inside the cotton mill, so my husband had a word with Mr. Riggs, and he took me up to show me what they were doing. And they had brought a lot of Maltese labourers in, because labour was quite short after the war. And Mr. Riggs himself was leaving there. And I had an aunt who was an accountant, and she did the accounts for a very big store in my hometown. And when she came up here, we took her about. She was enchanted, because she saw the mills where she said, I have paid out hundreds of thousands of pounds to these places, Rosebank Fabrics and Riggs's Mill. And I have a daughter who lives in Greece. She is married to a Greek, and his grandmother all had trousseau. That's the collection of things she took when she was married. Before the war, came from Riggs's Mill and Horrocks's local mills, which is a strange link across 3 generations.